Episode 2 of Inside the DBL. Welcome back. So glad to be here. We have a lot to cover today, and we're going to be winging it a little bit because I didn't have a ton of time to prepare, a ton of different topics. I wasn't sure which ones I wanted to prioritize, but because there's so much content between the draft, the trade deadline, obviously the playoff push. I wanted to sort through what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to maybe save. And I realized I want to cover it all. So I'm going to touch on little bits and pieces of it. And then obviously we have draft grades coming out. We'll have trade deadline grades coming out. So I'm going to save the bulk of the content for those articles. And then I will just sort of preview them today and share some thoughts on what's going on around the league. So we'll jump right into it. Thank you, obviously, like I said, for joining me. We'll start with the big news of the day. So we have draft stuff certainly to get to, but we're going to kind of conclude the show with that, I think. Just a little bit of a draft grades preview. We had a big trade come in yesterday that we certainly have to talk about. But the big news today just dropped. Sources are all over this story that Andres Munoz reportedly has put his Louisiana property on the market because the front office has notified his agent that he will be traded almost certainly before Wednesday's deadline. So from what I'm hearing, there are multiple contenders interested. GM Ethan Sadowitz did not want to reveal the identities of the teams and general managers that he has been in conversations with. My sources are thinking it's likely that Atlanta is highly interested. According to sources close to the Blizzards organization, the current offer on the table from a contender is two first round picks, a second round pick, and a fringe top 100 prospect. Now, I've heard that Dansville has made an offer as well. I heard that they made an offer that actually exceeded that threshold. I believe, according to some vague sources that I trust, it was a first round pick, a second round pick, and two top 100 prospects. And I'm hearing that the Blizzards are thinking of turning that second round pick in 2027 into a first. So long story short, the Dansby Lions, I know for sure are interested. I checked in with my sources close to that organization, and my other sources are indicating that it is likely that Atlanta has made an offer and Akron is also interested as well. So Andres Munoz, obviously a top of the line relief pitcher. It's an interesting deadline. Almost all of the available big ticket items that we're going to touch on in just a moment are arms. But Munoz is probably the top reliever available. Now, obviously, he's been incredibly productive over the last couple of years. He hasn't been certainly as reliable as some of the other big name relief pitchers on the market. That's, obviously his one sort of glaring flaw. 7 losses in back-to-back years in 2023 and 2024, and now in 2025, 6 blown saves just halfway through the season. So if you're looking for a guy who's going to put up big numbers, he's the guy that can give you that, obviously. But late in the year, in September, obviously, you can't afford to have blow-up outings from, anybody, let alone the guys that you're depending on to be big ticket items, especially at the high price of $30 million a year that he is making. Can't afford to have them, blowing up with a loss or a blown save and really, making it difficult, digging a hole too deep to climb out of against another elite playoff team. So I am hearing that it's growing in likelihood that that Baton Rouge will cover this year and next year of his contract, and then whichever contender lands him will pay that third year in 2027, the final year of his unrestricted deal at just over $30 million a year. So my thoughts, like I said, I don't think he's as dependable as I would like to see in a deadline acquisition of that, sort of magnitude and the price that it's going to cost. It's sounding like it's going to cost somewhere in the vicinity of two first round picks, uh, and probably either another second and a top 100 guy or two top 100 guys, something along those lines. It seems like that's where the market is landing on his competitive price. So now that I've sort of addressed Munoz and the teams interested, I wanted to go over probably like the top five biggest ticket items in this year's free agent class and talk about the sources that I've talked to and where I think they're going to land and essentially predict the top five big name free agents in this year's class. Or I keep saying free agents, trade deadline targets in this year's class that are likely on the move. Now, before I do that, I want to talk about a couple guys, a couple maybe reach picks that aren't rumored to be in trade negotiations, but could potentially be moved before Wednesday's deadline as a surprise, huge blockbuster deal. Now, Will Smith is a guy in Baltimore that I know at least one general manager has inquired about. Um, there's no indication as a 2028 unrestricted free agent that GM Matty Sticks Vajore and the Bradfords are looking to move him. Obviously, the Bradfords are right on the line of that second wild card spot and are still certainly in contention to make the playoffs. But in a disappointing season after two back-to-back finals appearances, it's somewhat within the realm of possibility that they could look to cash in and sell at this year's deadline. And if they do, Will Smith, will instantly become the biggest name on the market. I don't think he'll be moved. I think it would be very surprising to see them go in that direction so quickly with still so much talent, so close in the last 2 years, obviously, to a title, and probably would not make that stark of a redirection of sort of the trajectory of their franchise that quickly. So I doubt he's going to be moved, but I am hearing that a couple of general managers might be interested, and there have actually been conversations around Will Smith. Kyle Tucker in Houston is another guy that is unlikely to be moved, but could. It's considering he and then CJ Abrams as well, two guys in Houston that are on restricted deals. I would think it's unlikely, unless for a massive, massive price, that Houston moves him. Or CJ Abrams. We saw Merrill Kelly head over to the Aardvarks in exchange for Sandy Alcantara. That was, the first big move of the deadline, and that was probably Houston's top priority to trade for some future value. In the past, GM Dev Mills has been, sort of, he's taken a very homegrown approach, right? Oftentimes, very hesitant to move off of guys with long-term control, and I certainly understand that. Kyle Tucker, as well as CJ Abrams, obviously fit that mold. Another guy that I would be surprised to see change uniforms in just a couple of days is Corbin Carroll of the Studs. He is under long-term control, certainly restricted through 2028, but that is an opportunity for Pittsburgh, who has after the Suarez trade and then obviously the first overall pick in Ethan Holiday, has accumulated a lot of really valuable assets in the farm system. It is an opportunity to get a huge haul and maybe just, I don't know, delay that rebuild a little bit more. Really try to strengthen that class of guys coming up around maybe 2027, 2028, especially considering the fact that by the time they get competent on the field and become a competitive, playoff contender, Carroll will be at the end of his deal. They'll have to sign him probably for a pretty substantial price, and they might look to move off of him anyway. So if they are able to move him now, obviously they could get a ton. And I would be surprised because it's very rare to see a rebuilding team move off of such a young, talented, productive player who, you know, is much more reliable and much more predictable than these prospects because we've seen him produce at the major league level. It's rare to see that, but I think it's possible. Now, let's get into the guys who are almost certainly going to be moved before Wednesday's deadline. Matthew Boyd is a starting pitcher, probably the top starting pitcher in this trade deadline class of the Honolulu Murder Hornets. I hear they're actually closing in on a deal to move him. My sources tell me Dansville is very interested, and they've had some very serious conversations around Matthew Boyd. He is a rental. He is a 2025 unrestricted free agent at $5 million for the rest of this season. Obviously, an up and down career, but performing and pitching very, very well this year with 1.97 points per game. I'm hearing that Dansville made an offer somewhere in the vicinity of a fringe top 100 prospect for Boyd and potentially a draft pick alongside Matthew Boyd. And there was another team that has had very serious conversations as well, from what I have heard. So at least two teams interested in Matthew Boyd. Honolulu obviously is not making the playoffs this year in the Vintage Conference. They're about 6 or 7 games out by now, and he's a guy obviously just under contract through the rest of this year that is almost certainly going to be moved. I think he could fit really well in Dansville. They have obviously a very strong pitching staff, but a lot of the injuries that they sustained in the offseason and early this season have not healed particularly well. It's been a really difficult year for them. In the health department, there are 5 or 6 starting pitchers that were supposed to be, a part of their staff in 2025 who haven't even seen the field because they're not yet back from injury. And so as the season progresses, obviously that's a team alongside the Kings, both looking to add at the deadline, so to speak, by nature of just getting healthier and adding players that they already possess, just coming back from injury. But some of these injuries, especially in Dansville, are taking a lot longer than expected. I've heard from the organization, my sources there, that they are 100% going to add at least 1, if not 2, starting pitchers at the deadline. They don't trust some of the guys that have been banged up to come back and produce. And from what I'm hearing, it's almost certain that they're going to add a starting pitcher. So Matthew Boyd certainly will be moved. Can't imagine anything else. Christopher Sanchez is another guy in Philadelphia. Again, 2025 unrestricted free agent, having a fantastic year with 2.01 points per game. Obviously, GM Brian Shimada has been a little bit stingy in the past. He has not been quick to pull the trigger on deals surrounding his top talent, but Christopher Sanchez as well as Framber Valdez, 2 guys unrestricted after this year who make 0 sense to waste away the rest of this season on the cheesesteaks. So I know Dansville's checked in on Framber Valdez. They had a conversation. I think Atlanta is interested as well, and I think Akron has also had some internal conversations about both Framber Valdez and Christopher Sanchez. I have not heard any concrete rumors or information about either one. From what I am hearing, Philadelphia has not even engaged in any concrete conversations regarding actual assets around either of their 2 starting pitchers that will likely be moved. Whether or not that means they're not going to trade them or that means they're holding out till the last minute. We've seen that strategy work in years past where closing in on Wednesday at 8 o'clock, teams, contenders especially, get a little bit desperate, especially when other contenders around them are making moves to improve. So it seems like that's GM Ryo's sort of MO here at the deadline, as it has been in years past. My sources, like I said, have told me they have not had a single concrete conversation around either of those starting pitchers. The one exception could be Atlanta. I've heard that they may or may not have had concrete conversations with the Philadelphia front office, but certainly are interested. And the same is true with the Indians in Mumbai as well. Like I mentioned, very few bats on the market. It seems like anybody trying to add a bat is probably going to add, a depth piece, or maybe somebody who's coming off a down year or having a down year this year. There aren't any big can't miss bats on the market right now. Bryce Harper, we saw obviously a few years back, sign that massive deal in Manhattan. And he's kind of a guy right now that Manchester is having a phenomenal season. Maybe could have become available at this year's deadline, certainly next year's deadline. That's obviously not going to be the case anymore. He's going to obviously kind of frontline and spearhead them into a playoff run. So there's a couple of guys like that. Manchester has a few of them that, unrestricted guys, but their teams need them right now for the remainder of the season, and then obviously in September. So it seems like the bulk of I keep saying free agent, the trade deadline moves are going to be arms. Another arm on the market is Trevor Rogers of the Bonzos. Again, another guy, and we see this a lot every year, basically, especially pitchers who are obviously inconsistent. A guy having a really strong year who historically hasn't really been nearly as productive as he has this year. An opportunity for a team like the Bonzos to cash in and get something, for him that probably doesn't even necessarily warrant that sort of a package. Probably, like I said, historically not productive enough to demand that type of a package. But we know at the deadline every year, teams get desperate. Teams need to have that leg up, and they'll make a move and probably overspend on a guy who's having a good year and they think can keep it going for, another couple months. Trevor Rogers is the perfect example of that. He's a 2026 unrestricted free agent, so they'd be getting another year as well. I believe Bismarck has checked in about Trevor Rogers. I think Dansville has as well. Again, no evidence, no sources. I don't have anything concrete to share about Trevor Rogers, but I would be surprised if he's not moved at the deadline. Again, the one exception is he is still under contract for 2026 as well. And from what I have heard from the Bonzos, they're only really eager to move guys from that 2025 class. One example of which we'll obviously get to later in the show. 2026 guys, they're taking calls on, but are not necessarily eager to make that happen. Wilson Contreras of the Emperors, if we are going in the bats direction, is certainly a guy who could be moved. He's a 2026 unrestricted free agent. We just saw Tyler Heineman sent to the Dansby Lions from the Emperors. Contreras has not been catching throughout this year for that club. He will now in the absence of Tyler Heineman. So he's probably their catcher for next year. Probably doesn't mean a whole lot. The Emperors are obviously having a fire sale. And then the big news came in today that Trevor Story is going to be moved almost certainly before Wednesday's deadline. And we'll touch on that in a second as well. But Wilson Contreras is a guy, a lot of teams looking for backstops at the deadline. Dansville already got theirs, and obviously we hadn't really seen other conversations even around Heineman, who was probably the more valuable asset. So I would be surprised to see Contreras have sort of a bidding war around him. It doesn't seem like there's a ton of interest, but I would guess that he is moved because it looks like Port-au-Prince is really trying to accelerate this rebuild and get a lot of capital, especially in the draft for 2026. So that's sort of a broad picture, a broad analysis of what the deadline may look like. We had a couple of sources come in with some new information today. One of which, as I sort of foreshadowed right there, was Trevor's story of the Emperors. Now, not having the best of years, certainly, historically productive, and shortstop is obviously a marquee position. I was heard that, obviously, we all saw the news. He went on the block earlier today. According to what I've heard, there haven't really been any serious conversations. It doesn't seem like the market for him is all that fruitful. And I think that's because, and this is sort of a bigger argument or opinion, it seems this year, now a lot of it is the fact that it just so happens the class is very pitcher heavy, but it seems like teams this year especially are recognizing the importance of pitching, not just starting pitching, but the bullpen as well. And because, and this has been the case really since 2017, since scoring was introduced. It doesn't feel like bats are all that important this year, right? We've seen pitching make up and account for the difference in wins and losses in about 80% of matchups, maybe 70 to 80% of matchups. It's only 20 to 30% of matchups where hitting the absolute value of the difference in hitting points is greater than that of the difference in pitching points. So the vast majority of games are decided by pitching. And I think teams now, in years past have sort of taken the approach of they want to fill their holes. They don't want to have any position on the field represented by, a below average player or an underproducing player. And I think now, especially with so much more parity this year, and it's much more difficult to add those top guys, and there are very few teams that have a lot of them because they're so spread out around the league, and even the teams that possess them that aren't really in playoff contention are a lot more, I don't know if stingy is the right word, but a lot more intelligent about what they can get, right? There's a lot more data as years go on for their sort of market for each of these, potential acquisitions. And so I think the prices are going up, and I think the cap space for contenders is going down. So it's more difficult to acquire these players. In all likelihood, and this wasn't the case in years past, a contender's really only going to have the assets and the cap space to add one big ticket item, right? In the past, we've seen Dansville, Akron especially, Michigan at times add 2, 3, 4 big ticket all-star level players at the deadline. That's really not the reality of our sport anymore. And so I think that's a big reason why arms are dominating this trade deadline season more so than they have in years past. Again, a lot of it, like I said, is just the breakdown of this class. There are a lot more good available arms than there are bats. But my point in all of this is we saw the news break today. Trevor's story is now available. And from what I've heard, there haven't been any serious conversations regarding that player, because I don't think, and that probably will change as teams make their moves. They solidify their pitching staff, right? And then they can sort of move on to the second level, the second wave of deadline acquisitions, right? We usually see the big ticket guys go with a couple days left, and then teams sort of make those smaller additions closer to the deadline. I think the culture of this league has changed. I think it's become a pitching league. Everything runs through starting pitching, especially. And like I said, 70 to 80% of the matchups have been decided by pitching this year, and only about 20 25% have been made up with the bats offensively. So, I think teams are afraid to add and use capital to add a big bat. And Story, obviously, the other piece of it is he's not been particularly productive this year. But I think teams are realizing they only really have the capital to go out and get one big name guy, and they want to make sure they use that capital to acquire an arm. So I was not really surprised, maybe a little bit, to see such a quiet market around Story, but I think it's just the nature of where the league is headed and the culture and how much pitching has become on the forefront of everybody's minds. So the other big news this week was Blake Snell to the Beefcakes. So I'm going to talk about the move. I'm going to grade the move for both sides. And, we see this every year. We see, and I think some of the best GMs in this league have done this really, really well. And that's go out and pursue a guy that flies under the radar. Maybe he's not having the best year. Maybe he's coming off an injury. We saw last year, for example, Jacob deGrom go over to Dansville. It didn't end up making an appearance for them. We saw Alex Bregman as well from the Emperors, a guy who was having a down year, probably forecasting to turn it around just based on their historic production. Blake Snell is a perfect example of that, right? Not having a great year, he was hurt, just came back, and has sort of taken some time to still get his footing underneath him, coming off an injury. And here's a guy that was not necessarily on the forefront of everyone's mind. We talked about all these pitchers that I mentioned. What my sources have told me have been in conversations around, and Blake Snell was not one of those guys. I hadn't heard of any serious conversations around him. Kind of flew under the radar, and GM Austin Stable Chunks swoops in and grabs him and adds, a very volatile pitcher, a guy that I've been very critical of in the past, as you know, but a big time ceiling, and obviously as he gets healthier, could be a real huge addition for a pitching staff that has been pretty up and down over the last couple of years. So they add Snell, in exchange for a couple of prospects and a second and fourth round pick. I'm going to give the Beefcakes an A for this move. It's a fantastic move. They didn't give a ton up. I mentioned the second and the fourth round pick in 2026. David Davalillo, Hunter Barco, and Arun Escobar headed to Boulder as well. So they didn't give up anything that they're probably seriously going to miss in the foreseeable future. 3 prospects. Barco has taken a really long time to develop, and perfect example of a guy that pretty soon, you're going to have to start either cashing in for some value or just accepting that, he's not going to kind of turn out to be what he once was thought to be. Arun Escobar, international prospect, is interesting as well. But I love this move for the Beefcakes. I think they added a serious left-handed arm that could frontline that staff. And obviously when you add a pitcher of that quality, it sort of pushes everything else down, and it's a franchise that struggled to put together a 5-man consistent and dependable rotation. So not only do they add a top flight guy, a guy who can go out and put up 5, 6, 7 points in a game, but it adds so much more stability and so much more depth to that staff. They gave up a good amount of capital, but I think this is a great move for them. They got out ahead of the market, didn't let him go into sort of a bidding war, had some internal conversations. It's a really clever move. So I love it for the Beefcakes. For the Bonzos, I'm going to give them a B. I think it's a good move. I think they got a good amount. I think they did a good job of, making sure that they're guaranteed to sort of realize some of the capital. Right, next year they're getting two nice picks, a second round pick and a fourth round pick. They had a few prospects who may or may not produce, but at the very least they're going to use those picks, and they're gonna, it's not like they're moving him for one super volatile, unpredictable asset, right? They're getting serious value there, no matter what happens. Now, how much value we'll see, but obviously coming off injury, having a sort of not so great start to the year, they probably weren't going to get much more. I tend to think they could have gotten more if they maybe tested the market, obviously, and shopped him around a little bit. But because of the injury, because of his difficult start, I don't think they would have ended up getting a whole lot more. And so this is a trade where, an example of a trade where I think both sides couldn't really have asked for much more. So I'm going to give them a B. But I love this move for the Beefcakes. Really, more than anything, right? Like obviously acquiring a really nice player, but really impressive to see them, like I said, get out ahead of the market, and add what could be probably the most productive player from this trade deadline class for not all that much. And he's volatile, right? Like it's very possible that they just gave away all this capital for basically nothing if he continues to pitch the way he has this year coming off injury. But those are the chances you have to take. And it's not a style of move that we've seen from Bismarck really in the past, right? They've certainly been aggressive in the trade market, but not this risky. And I think it's the type of move that a contender has to make, especially when they're a little bit on the outside looking in, like they are in Bismarck. So great move for both sides, but especially the Beefcakes. I'm going to wrap up with this final segment. We have to talk about the draft a little bit. We did the whole sort of free agency thing. More on that to come, obviously, as the week unfolds. But I have two sort of draft stories that we have to get to, and then we'll wrap it up. And then obviously the draft grades will be sort of a more fleshed out discussion and conversation around my thoughts as to how last week went. Now, I've talked about the studs and Ethan Holiday a few times. I obviously talked about it in advance of the draft. It was pretty much a slam dunk that Holiday was going to go to the studs at number 1. They didn't have a second round pick, and they had the rest of their picks 3 through 10. I don't want to spoil too much for the draft grades because they are coming out soon, but I thought the studs in GM John Luca Turndorf's first year, in a situation where they have talent. So this is not one of those rebuilds. This is not like Boulder, right? This is not like Port-au-Prince, where they got to just accumulate talent for the future and let it grow, right? They're on the brink with some really clever moves. They could really rewrite this ship in the next year or two. And I don't think they accomplished that in this year's draft. I think it was a complete and utter whiff. Holiday at 1, you can't really go wrong. He's a high floor, can't miss prospect. But given that they didn't have a second round pick, they traded it in the Ranger Suarez deal. They did acquire a lot of good prospects in that deal, but I think they needed to be more aggressive with the first overall pick. And if they didn't want to be, I think they should have moved the first overall pick for more draft picks later on, especially seeing as they didn't have a second. They could have gotten a late first and maybe even a second and a next year second. I could definitely see that for the number 1 pick. Not only do they, not going that route and using the pick, sure, but going out and taking a safe prospect doesn't make a lot of sense for me, with that spot, at that spot, because they have, first of all, they have a lot of really good infield prospects. I know a lot of people believe in best available, and I think in a lot of cases I do too, but I don't think that Holiday is going to be a franchise-changing player, and I think they probably disagree. So it's not so much the approach that I disagree with. Um, I don't think they would have made that selection if they didn't think he could be a franchise-changing player, but I don't think their scouting department did enough in this year's draft cycle, and I think that anybody who has scouted Holiday and some of the other and this is not a shot at Ethan Holiday, right? Like I have no problem with Ethan Holiday. He's a great prospect, and he could be a fantastic player. And I'm not saying he can't be a really, really valuable player, but it's a safe pick. And I think with a lot of, we've seen in years past the top guys producing at the major league level within a year or two, right? And Holiday is not going to be that guy, which isn't a reason not to take him, right? You can, if he's going to be that good, you should obviously be willing to wait. But I just don't think he has the ceiling requisite for a first overall pick. And so I've talked about this at length. I don't need to belabor the point, but beyond Holiday, even if you're going to give them Holiday and say that that was a solid pick, because it wasn't a bad pick, right? Obviously, it wasn't a crazy reach and had the opportunity to waste a first over, but like he's going to be a productive, valuable player. The rest of the draft to me was a disaster. No second round pick. I don't understand why they didn't look to replace the second that they lost in that trade. I'm not really quite sure why they traded it in the first place. I think they could have still made that deal without giving up a second round pick in a draft class with a really, really strong back of the first round, and into the second and third round. Like the top of this draft, which is another reason why I think they should have traded this pick, was very, very weak. I think the rest of it was one of the strongest draft classes I've seen in a very long time. So number one, they didn't replace the second round pick that they lost, right? They had to wait all the way until pick 41 to make their second selection. And every prospect basically that they took for the rest of the draft was a low ceiling, massive bust potential guy, right? Like I don't understand. Obviously you're always looking for that balance, right? Between safety and dependability and ceiling, right? I can totally understand. I have no problem with them taking guys with high bust potential if they have a ceiling requisite of using that draft capital on that prospect. Cam Leiter, right? None of these guys, for example, Cam Leiter is a great example. I don't even see the ceiling, right? Michael Oliveto with the 41st pick. I don't, I just don't understand it, right? I don't see, it's not aggressive and it's not safe either, right? It's safe without providing an opportunity for, franchise changing players. And I think I could go either way. I would love to see them make some really risky picks, guys with massive bust potential. But if they pan out, right, there's from rounds 3 through 10, they had 8 picks. If they use 8 picks on highly volatile guys, 2 or 3 of them are probably going to be really productive MLB players. Or I could see maybe they go 8 safe picks, right? And just use the draft, and especially the later rounds of the draft, to kind of build up the roster and deepen the roster to support some of the Ethan Holidays and the Bryce Rayners, right? And the guys that they're going to add in free agency. That's another strategy as well. They didn't do either. They took a lot of guys with high bust potential, way ahead of their where I think they should have landed in the draft, because they don't have the ceiling to compensate for that, right? It's guys like Cam Leiter. It's guys like Mason Morris, Michael Oliveto. Not productive, maybe some flashy tools, but have really struggled, in game, in game play. And I just didn't get it. I thought it was a complete whiff, complete disaster draft from the studs. And it's disappointing, because I thought this year has gone so well for them. The Suarez deal was an amazing deal for them. They have played okay on the field, right? And it's sort of, they've started to actually build a culture this early on. in GM John-Luca Turndorf's tenure. So I think they've been having a strong year, and he's had a strong start to his career in his second opportunity with the DBL franchise. But I think this draft was a golden opportunity for them to really just throw some gasoline on the fire of this rebuild, and I don't think that they accomplished that. I'm going to conclude with a big winner from the draft in a more positive light. I wanted to kind of do like 3 winners, 3 losers, that kind of a segment, but I want to save. I don't want to give too much away of the draft grades because that is coming very, very soon. And so I just want to talk about, because I could not do this show this week without talking about Los Dominicanos, the best draft that they have ever had in the history of their franchise. Number one, they get Ava Arquette with the 7th pick. Obviously, a lot of that is how the top 6 shake out and what's left to them. But they still have to make the right pick, and they did. They got the Golden Spikes winner with the 7th pick. Unbelievable value there. I didn't expect them to make that move. I knew, I had talked to some sources that I trust close to their organization, and I knew they were going to be aggressive in this year's draft. I know they had a very distinct plan. That's what they kept saying. All of my sources kept telling me, watch out for Los Dominicanos this year in the draft. They've been scouting like crazy. I've heard that they were sending scouts apparently they doubled their scouting budget this year from years past, if not tripled. And but so Arquette is not a outlandish pick, but a phenomenal prospect to get with the 7th overall pick. And they, didn't have to do much, right, to make that selection, but it was the right one, and they didn't overthink it. So got to give him some credit for that. Patrick Forbes in the 2nd round, unbelievable value. I think there were some more, better, maybe more highly productive college players available, like an Alex Lodice or a Devin Taylor or a Wahewa Eloy, but unbelievable value with Patrick Forbes at 27. It was only a matter of time before Patrick Forbes fell off the board, and I'm really proud of them. I'm really impressed by their ability, because Forbes is a guy, right? Like he hasn't been absurdly productive in college, and he doesn't even have eye-popping tools. He's just a very dependable, effective prospect and pitcher with a high ceiling, because he has some really exciting tools that don't necessarily jump out visually. But if you really dig deep, he's a complete pitcher with a lot of room to grow. So I could tell from this draft, Dorian Soto in the 3rd round, an international prospect, I could tell that Los Dominicanos were doing real due diligence this year in advance of the draft. And then Miguel Syme Jr. in the 5th round, unbelievable value in the 5th round. I was surprised to see him last that long. But incredible ceiling, obviously hitting triple digits with ease, good 3 to 4 pitch mix, and physically very, very projectable, big right-handed power arm with pretty good command for how hard he throws. So outstanding value with their 5th round pick. Jacob Parker in the 6th. I mean, it was honestly steal after steal. I mean, I was sitting there during the draft watching, and I was enamored with what Los Dominicanos was able to come up with. Even a guy like Andrew Schaffner and Bobby Boser as well in the 7th and 8th round. You could just totally see they had a concrete vision. They had a very well thought out approach, and they executed it, right? Obviously, you can do all the scouting you want. You can put as much time and effort into it as you want, but then you have to go out and make the right decisions on draft day in order to make that happen. And I think that they did both, and that was really impressive, especially for a team that has not drafted well in years past, in my opinion. So they were one of the big winners. We have a couple other big winners that obviously I'm going to talk about in the draft grades, but I don't want to spoil too much. So we're at 45 minutes. I still can't decide if I want to make these shows a half hour or an hour. Please let me know your thoughts. But since we're right smack in the middle of that, I think we are probably in a good spot to cut this one and look ahead to what's going to be an incredible week at the trade deadline on Wednesday at 8 p.m. So thank you for joining me. Really appreciate it. Let me know what you guys want to see or hear more appropriately in future episodes because I'm always open to your suggestions. I want to provide whatever sort of content and information interests you. And thanks so much for watching. Get excited for the trade deadline. It's going to be chaotic as always, and I'm really looking forward to it. And next Sunday, we'll obviously have a huge trade deadline recap show. We'll probably spend most of, if not all, of our time in the next episode on Sunday, recapping what kind of chaos and madness went down every single year at the deadline. It's like, what's going on? When is stuff going to start to drop? And it looks like every year is going to be sort of a dud deadline, and then it never is. Like last year, we were like fewer than 24 hours away from the deadline. Nothing really had happened, and then it ended up becoming maybe the most interesting and crazy deadline in the history of the league. So without, I don't want to belabor that point or any other point. So I appreciate you joining me. Take it easy. Have a good one. Peace. And let me know what you want to see next week and beyond. Enjoy the deadline. Take care.